was 10 years old when I met the magician. I was a latchkey kid. After school, I'd come home by myself and wait for my mom and dad to get home from work. I'd usually be alone until around 6 or 7. Sometimes I was alone until 9. Sometimes there'd be dinner, but not always though. When you're alone for so much time, boredom eventually sets in. TV usually passed the time, but it didn't always hold my attention. Once you'd seen all the shows in the after-school lineup and the reruns started, they got boring pretty quickly. Still, I had to pass my time somehow, and that was what led me to the attic. I'd only ever been up to the attic a few times before, but I knew it was there and I knew how to access it. And that was where my dad kept his old things. I knew his old NES was up there, and I got it in my head that it might be fun to dig it up and see if I could make it work. On the day that I went looking for it, there was nothing on TV. I was about as bored as I could get. That NES system was sounding really good. I made myself a small snack of a peanut butter sandwich and brought a chair to the hallway upstairs. I needed something I could stand on so I could lower the ladder that led up into the attic. Looking back on it now, it was a reckless idea, but I didn't see why I shouldn't do it. Boredom and ignorant youth lead a person to stupid places. It was a hassle to get that ladder down, but, as my stubborn old grandmother would say, where there's a will, there's a way. And I found a way. I remember the way the ladder slid down with a slow creak, and I looked up into the darkness of the attic before I began my ascent. I wasn't afraid. I knew there was nothing up there that could hurt me. I was sure of it. There was a bare light bulb just within arm's reach that I turned on as I reached the top. Warm, golden light filled the attic, and for the briefest moment, I caught a glimpse of something moving away into the shadows. I paused, at first thinking it was something, and then dismissing it as a trick of the mind. I was alone up here. I had to be. Now, where was that NES? I started going through the boxes. There were a lot of old VHS tapes covered in a thick layer of dust. I remember seeing a copy of Red Shoe Diaries, among other movies that were not meant for people my age. There were rat trappings by a box with a broken lamp and stacks of leather-bound brown encyclopedias. So many old, forgotten pieces of my parents' lives, things that belonged to sides of them I'd never know of. Going through them was entertaining in and of itself, yet as I looked through the boxes, I heard movement behind me. I remember turning around and seeing a face peering at me from behind a modest stack of boxes. I only got a brief glimpse before it pulled back into the darkness, but that glimpse was enough to frighten me. Immediately, I was on my feet, torn between fleeing for safety and investigating. No one else should have been up there, but I was so sure I'd seen a man. "Hello?" I called. There was no answer, just a pregnant silence hanging heavy in the air. That silence did not reassure me, nor did it tell me that I was alone. I could hear the other person in the attic with me. I could hear their heavy, wheezing breaths. "Hello?" I asked again. No reply, but I saw movement from behind the boxes. The face reappeared, slowly leaning out into view. I remained still as the figure revealed themselves to me. It was a man. I'd been right about that. He looked to be fairly old, not elderly, but middle-aged. His face had weathered lines, and his sad eyes seemed to sag. His skin seemed devoid of color, and he had a bushy walrus mustache. His hair was graying, but still mostly brown. As he stepped into view, I saw that he wore a faded brown pinstripe suit that seemed a bit too big for him. It hung off of his scrawny body. His shoes, though scuffed, were polished and seemed far too big for him, but he moved with a cat-like grace. A ratty brown cape was fastened around his neck and trailed behind him with a notable lack of drama. In his hands, he timidly clutched an equally ratty brown top hat. He never said a word. He just shyly revealed himself to me, and I think he managed a slight smile as he did. He raised a hand to give me a nervous wave, but I still kept my distance. There was something about this man, like he'd stepped out of a bygone era. I chose my words to him carefully, just because he didn't seem immediately threatening. Didn't seem like he was a threat. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He offered no verbal explanation. Instead, he simply placed his hat on his head and reached into the jacket of his baggy suit and retrieved a deck of cards. He raised a finger as if asking me to give him a moment. I watched as he flipped the deck of cards to show me the bottom card, the 5 of clubs. He slowly passed his hand over the card, making a point to slowly rub it against the deck. When his hand moved, the card had changed. Now, it was the 2 of hearts. I watched his little card trick with confusion, but not disinterest. The man smiled at me, then flipped the deck again. He removed a single card and set the rest of the deck on a box to his left. He made a point to show me both the front and back of his card. It was a 6 of spades, with a red back. He flipped the back of the card to me, then flicked it with his fingers. Before my eyes, the back turned from red to blue. He flipped over the card again to show me its face. Now, it was the 6 of hearts. He held the card between his fingers before letting it go. It didn't fall. His hands hovered around the card, but it floated in place, quaking ever so slightly as it did. He let it hang there for a few moments, pausing so I could be amazed, before he snatched the card from the air and gave a hasty bow. "You're practicing card tricks?" I asked. He nodded enthusiastically. "What else can you do?" I asked. The magician seemed to think for a moment. He tapped his chin thoughtfully before gesturing that he had an idea. With a dramatic flair, he removed the hat from his head. He made a point to show me that there was nothing inside, then turned it down and gave it 3 shakes to make his point. From inside of his jacket, he took out a traditional magician's wand. He passed it over his upturned ratty hat, only to gawk as it went limp. With a frustrated huff, he shook the wand and set it straight again. I caught myself chuckling at his antics. He gave the wand a tap against the brim of his hat, just to make sure it wouldn't break on him this time, then passed it over his hat again. A white bird suddenly flew from inside the hat. I took a step back in surprise, but the bird posed no threat. It just cooed and found a perch on a set of boxes a few feet away from me. The magician bowed, and after a moment, I began to clap. It was a good trick, and being a 10-year-old, I had no idea how he did it. The magician smiled sheepishly before replacing his hat onto his head. With just a few tricks, he told me nothing about himself and everything. I watched as the magician checked a watch on his wrist. His hand pressed against his cheek in a gesture of surprise, and he clasped his hands together as if trying to apologize for something. He extended his wand out towards me. Reluctantly, I reached out and took it. As I pulled it free from his hand, the wand extended, revealing a bouquet of plastic flowers. I caught myself smiling as I looked to where the magician had been. But now, he was gone. without a trace that he'd ever been there, save for the wand in my hand. I headed over towards the boxes he'd been hiding behind, but there was nothing behind them. He was just completely gone. And that was the first time I met the magician. I found him again the next day, but unlike the first time, it was not by accident. I hadn't stopped thinking about the strange man living in my attic, or his fun little antics. I hadn't said a word about him to my parents, of course. I knew that if I did, they either wouldn't believe me or they'd go looking for him. I'd done a thorough enough search of the attic after he had vanished to know that there was not a single trace of him left, save for the wand he left behind. I had left that in the attic, hoping he would come back for it. I knew that I needed to see him again. Part of it was that I simply wanted to prove to myself that he existed, that he hadn't been just some strange dream I had. Besides, maybe if I saw him again, I might figure out just who or what he was. After school, I wasted no time in heading for the attic. I brought down the ladder and began the slow climb up. The attic was dark, as it always was, and when I turned on the light, I saw nothing but dusty boxes in the light. It was almost disappointing, but no. I saw him. He just stood at the edge of the light, his back to me. I only caught the slight movement of his head when he looked at me with a wry smile on his lips. It was almost like he'd been expecting me. Slowly, the magician turned to face me. He bobbed a curtsy to me, offering a hand with a tiny red handkerchief hanging out of it. Looking at him, I found myself smiling. There was less hesitation this time. I took hold of the handkerchief and pulled it, along with the many other colorful handkerchiefs tied to it out of his sleeve. He acted alarmed, as if he had no idea how many handkerchiefs were up there. He pressed his hand dramatically to his face, looked down at his sleeve in awe, until at last I reached the last handkerchief. I leapt back in surprise as a white bird flew out of his sleeve and circled the room. I then laughed in awe of his display. I spent the afternoon up in the attic with the magician, watching his tricks for what felt like hours on end, until at last he bowed and vanished just like he had the day before. When he was gone, I didn't look for him. I simply left the attic, knowing that I would be back again tomorrow. Soon, my after-school visits to the magician became something regular. He never once spoke, but he performed his special tricks with a spirited gusto, and I enjoyed every one of them. It didn't take long for the questions to fade from my mind. There was no why behind the magician. He simply was. There was nothing to ask and nothing to know, but there was something to share. Austin was the first person other than myself to see the magician. Like me, his parents worked late. We'd been friends for a few years, and from time to time, he'd come over after school. Sometimes we spent PA days together, watching TV and goofing off. Austin met the magician on one such day. It had been his idea to hang out, and I'd been contemplating whether or not I should tell him about what I found. On the other hand, I had no guarantee that the magician would show up for anyone else but me. I didn't want to look like a fool if the magician didn't show, but if he did... We'd been playing classic Halo, and had fallen into the boring loop of killing each other for fun in the halls of one of the campaign levels. Austin was starting to look bored, and it wasn't long before he asked the inevitable question that was both on our minds. "Wanna play something else?" "I think my dad's old NES is upstairs," I said. "I got it to work the other day. You wanna try it?" I saw Austin perk up a bit. Like me, he'd grown up on classic video games. We both played our fair share of Super Mario at his place. "Yeah, let's get it," he said, immediately standing up. I was more than eager to lead him up into the attic. Best case scenario, he'd seen the magician too, and we would watch his show together. Worst case, we found that old NES. I went up the ladder first, and Austin followed me. As soon as I turned on the light, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. He was there. The magician kept himself hidden, but I knew he was there. "Are we supposed to be up here?" Austin asked as he climbed the ladder after me. "Yeah, it's fine. I come up here all the time," I said. "Hey, want to see something really cool?" Austin raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Just trust me," I said. I looked over to where I'd seen movement. I could see the magician peeking out from behind his cover. I knew that Austin saw him too. "Who the hell is that?" he asked. I understood the panic in his voice, but it didn't worry me. He'd see that the magician meant no harm soon enough. It's fine. He's a friend," I said. "I found him up here like a week ago. He appears every now and then. Just watch." Austin held his ground, suspiciously watching as the magician slowly revealed himself. He waved timidly to myself and Austin before drawing nearer and revealing his deck of cards. He drew one from the top of the deck, making sure we got a good look at it. The Ace of Diamonds. His hand passed over the surface of the card, and as they did, they wiped the card blank. Austin watched in silence, but I could sense some of the tension melting away from him. We spent almost an hour up in the attic, watching as the magician performed for us. Some of his tricks I'd seen before, but they were new to Austin. I could tell that he was getting drawn into his performance, just as I had once been. Besides, it was refreshing to know that someone else could see him. It made him feel more real. At the end of his show, the magician bowed and vanished, just like he always did. Austin clapped, but didn't say a word. He seemed a bit thunderstruck by what he'd seen. "Where'd he go?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "He kinda just disappears when he's gone." "What is he? A ghost? How many times have you seen him?" "I don't know. I see him about once a day," I said. "I was hoping you'd see him too. You know, I guess so I'd know I wasn't crazy." "If you're crazy, so am I," Austin murmured. "Jeez, man, that's so weird." He paused as he spotted a box with the wires of the NES controller sticking out, and he moved closer to it. He glanced at where the magician had been, but there was nothing left to see and nothing left to do except to get what we'd originally come for. He spent the rest of the day bombarding me with questions I couldn't answer as we ran through Super Mario together. "Does he have a name?" "I don't know, he never speaks." "Did you tell your parents about him?" "They'd probably freak out. He's not really hurting anyone. He's just a magician." None of those answers seemed to satisfy Austin, but he took them for what they were. He started coming to my house a lot more often after that. Together, we'd watch the magician as he went through his performances, a new one every day with new tricks. It was kind of amazing how he always found new tricks and rarely ever repeated them, but somehow he did. In time, Austin seemed to stop caring about the questions he had, much like I did. He just enjoyed the show, up until the day where we saw the poster. It had been a school day, just like any other. Austin and I had rushed over to my house in anticipation of the magician's latest performance. He waited impatiently as I lowered the ladder and followed me up to the attic. But when we got there was no sign of the magician. There was no movement out of the corner of my eye. There was nothing at all, save for a poster on the wall that had not been there before. Slowly, I approached it. While it was a new addition, the poster looked ancient and weathered. The edges of it were tattered and brown. The design was simple, with no pictures, only text in a dated font that read, "Magic show for all ages. Come one, come all. Bring all your friends. Marvel at the mystical majesty of the masterful magician. Delight at the delicate dance of divinity depicted. Tomorrow." "What's it say?" Austin asked, as he drew closer to read it for himself. "Tomorrow," he repeated. "Has he ever done anything like this before?" No, I said. "He usually just appears. Maybe this will be different." "It says to bring friends," Austin said. "Maybe he wants a bigger audience." "Maybe." "We should tell some of the kids at school. Everyone would love this. Come on, it'll be awesome." "I don't know," I said. "We'd have to bring them all here, and if we did, we'd need to explain it to my parents." "Why couldn't we just tell them?" Austin suggested. "Maybe they'll want to see it too." "No, dude, they'll freak out if they see this," I said. "They'll want to know why there's a magician living in their attic. They might just try and kick him out." Austin paused at that. "You're right. We can't tell them," he finally said. "But he still wants an audience. He'll have us," I said. "We'll come up and watch him tomorrow." I knew that Austin wasn't happy with that, but he didn't question it. Not to my face, at least. When the next day rolled around, I finished school and came home alone. I sat in my living room, waiting patiently for Austin to join me, and when he knocked on my door, I was quick to answer it. I didn't expect to see so many other kids with him. It wasn't too many, just 5. People I knew from class: Emma, Jake, Petey, Kevin, and Laura. They stood crowded behind Austin, who wore a sheepish smile. He didn't need to offer an explanation. I knew exactly what he'd done. "How many people did you tell?" I asked. "Just a few," Austin assured me. "It's just these guys, I promise." I almost closed the door in his face. I should have, but I didn't. Something made me keep it open, and something made me step aside to let the other kids in. "I'll go pull down the ladder to the attic," I said. Like a person in a dream, I led the other kids upstairs. As we ascended, I heard the ladder creaking as it lowered. I saw that it was down by the time we reached the top of the stairwell. It beckoned to us. The light of the attic was already turned on. The magician was waiting. Slowly, I walked towards the ladder and began to ascend it. Austin followed, as did the kids that he brought. The attic looked almost the same as it always had, save for one difference. One of the boxes had been pushed to the sides, leaving a clear space for us to sit. A few of the more sturdy boxes had been left out to act as chairs. There were exactly 7. I picked one to sit on, near the back, and watched as the other kids sat around me. A heavy silence filled the air. Then I heard it. The music was distorted, and I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it sounded like some upbeat circus calliope music. A puff of smoke appeared in front of us, and from it, I saw the magician emerge, a shy smile beneath his mustache. His arrival was greeted with silence, although I could see a grin spreading on Austin's face from the anticipation. The performance began. There were no recycled tricks. I watched as the magician made cards levitate out of the deck and juggled multiplying balls. It was no less exciting than usual, but something seemed off. I didn't know what. Was it just my nerves? Austin had brought a lot of kids, and while there were familiar faces, none of them were close friends or people I knew super well. Regardless, they seemed to be enjoying the show. As the magician finished his juggling act, he caught all the balls with one hand before revealing that he was only holding a single ball. He winked at us before the ball disappeared up his sleeve. He tapped his chin as if thinking. He paced around for a moment before thinking of something. He then raised a part of his cape and took out his magician's wand. He waved it in the air as he dropped his cape, letting it fall to the floor. There had been nothing behind it before, but now there was a stack of 3 colorful boxes with doors on them. He reverently removed his hat and set it down on the top box and lifted his wand over it. He gave the hat a tap before opening the top door. There was a woman's head inside of it. Most of the other kids clapped. I did not. No. I distinctly remembered that I recoiled. There was something wrong with her. As the magician opened the rest of the doors of the boxes, revealing his assistant, who gave us a timid wave, I was overcome with a deep sensation of discomfort. The woman's eyes were half-lidded and hid a vacant expression. She looked as if she was barely looking at us. Her movements were boneless. When she waved, her hand seemed to flip from side to side, and the gesture seemed inhuman. The smile she gave seemed less like a smile and more like a contortion of her lips into some sort of grimace. She looked like something that was dead. Her head seemed to slump to the side, as if her neck were broken. She wore a short pink dress with brown leggings and gloves. She wore a headband with a pink feather in the middle, and none of it made her look any less dead. Thankfully, I only had to look at her for a moment. As soon as she'd been revealed, the magician closed the doors again to seal her inside. He reached into his suit jacket and took out what looked to be a large saw. He then began to methodically cut through the space between the boxes. He took his time as he did it, acting as if he was getting caught on something as he cut through them. He started with the top box before lifting it off the rest of them. He set it on the ground, then started on the next box. I watched with a sinking feeling in my stomach, unsure if this was a trick or not. In fact, I wasn't sure what this was at all. At last, the magician took the box that should have contained the top part of his assistant and opened it, revealing nothing inside. He did the same for the other 2 parts of the box, before stacking them again in the wrong order. He opened the middle box, and I was treated to another look at that dead-eyed creature that passed as his assistant. All she did was smile vacantly before the magician hastily closed the box and pretended to look embarrassed before putting everything in the right order again. Then he opened all the boxes and let that horrific assistant of his free. She bowed, but it seemed more as if she was flopping over dead. The sight of it made me want to run away, but Austin and the others just applauded. Why? How? Were they not seeing what I was seeing? The magician looked at me. For the first time, I realized just how clammy his skin looked. Not like it was wet or sickly, but almost seemed like rotten, dried paper. He smiled at me before resuming his act, but I didn't want to see it anymore. I wanted to tell the others to leave. I wanted to run as far as I could, call my parents and tell them to come home, whatever it took to make the stop. But the show went on. That awful, dead-eyed assistant helped the magician remove his cape, and as she did, he gestured to Austin and the other kids around him. I saw Austin's eyes light up. "He wants our help," he said. He looked over at me, as if hoping I would go up there with him, but I was rooted to my seat in fear. Austin didn't hesitate. He was the first to stand and join the magician. I watched as the magician and his assistant gestured for others to come up as well. I watched them go until it was just me. The magician gestured for me to come, but I couldn't move. I stayed rooted in my seat. He smiled, revealing crooked yellow teeth, and gestured again. Slowly, I shook my head. The magician shrugged. He took his cape back from his boneless assistant and let her take position behind the other children. She knelt behind them and spread her arms wide to encompass all 6 of them. I looked into Austin's eyes and saw him grinning, excited for what would come next. The cape fell over them, the magician letting it sit there, draped over them for a few moments before he looked at me. He gave his wand a slow, deliberate wave before pulling his cape away. They were gone. Austin, the assistant, Emma, Jack, Kevin, Petey, and Laura. All of them were gone, with not so much as a trace left behind. The magician looked at me. It was just us in the attic, just like it had been before. But this time, my heart was racing. This time, I was afraid. The magician draped the cape over his shoulders again and took off his hat and gave me one final bow. And just like that, he was gone. The show was over, and I was alone. It was only then that I told my parents what I saw, and of course, they didn't believe me. Even when the police showed up, looking for the missing children, they didn't believe me. Not really. I won't recount the details of the investigation. Sharing those might make me identifiable, but it was a long and hellish process that tore my family apart and brought my mental health into question. There was an official diagnosis, and there are pills that I still need to take to this day. I'd rather not get into that, though. The police would never find Austin or the others. In the end, it was all chalked up to a kidnapping, and I was considered a traumatized witness. I suppose the description is not entirely inaccurate. There isn't a day that goes by when I don't think about the magician. I will never forget the way he looked, with his silent tricks and surreal charisma. I will never understand what he was, what he wanted, or stop questioning the choices I made and the things I did, because I don't remember why I did them, and sometimes I'm not entirely sure it was my choice. But those awful memories are not why I am sharing this now. I am sharing this because I have a daughter. She will be 12 next month, and I love her dearly. I'm sharing this because I caught her sneaking out of the attic when I got home from work yesterday. She wouldn't tell me what she was doing up there, but she doesn't need to. I already know, and I'm not letting him take another child.
Please leave your message